What you're about to see has never happened in royal history. Princess Charlotte, with just a subtle hand signal, gave a secret code that no one expected. But here's the burning question. Why did this single gesture force a royal guard to break decades of tradition right in front of the entire crowd? This wasn't just unusual. It nearly violated royal protocol, something guards are sworn never to do. Watch closely. Charlotte's hand moves ever so slightly, and the guard reacts instantly. But what followed next left the courtyard gasping in disbelief. Now, before we reveal the full story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The spring afternoon light bathed Buckingham Palace in gold, soft enough to make the cream stone glow, but bright enough to sharpen the details of every carved column and iron railing. The air hummed with the layered sounds of a tourist crowd pressed 3 deep against the black gates. Children perched on shoulders, guides waving miniature flags, voices in half a dozen languages blending with the clicks of cameras. Beyond the railings, the forecourt stretched wide and formal, its cobbled surface marked by centuries of boots. On that surface, still as statues beneath the weight of history, the guards stood. Among them was Guardsman Edward Lyle, Coldstream Guards. 28 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, he looked every bit the figure of tradition in his scarlet tunic, white cross belt, and the famous black bearskin hat that added height to his already imposing frame. His chin remained steady, his hands locked to his rifle with white-gloved precision. Not a muscle shifted as the crowd's restless energy washed against him like waves against a rock. For the tourists, he was a spectacle. For Edward, it was duty. And for him, duty carried more weight than most could see. Afghanistan had taught him that stillness wasn't always silence. Sometimes it was survival. 2 tours in Helmand province had carved lines of discipline into his very bones. Now, in the heart of London, surrounded by laughter and phone screens, he wore that discipline as surely as he wore the red wool across his chest. The ceremony was due to change in less than half an hour. The regimental band's brass notes drifted faintly from inside the gates, warming up for the formal exchange of posts. Tourists craned their necks for a better view, chattering about whether the guards would ever smile, ever move, ever break their mechanical stillness. It was then that a ripple of attention moved through the gathered crowd. Heads turned, phones raised, children gasped in the innocent excitement of recognition. A royal car had slipped quietly into the forecourt and stopped near the rope line reserved for dignitaries. From it stepped a slim young girl in a pale spring dress, chestnut hair neatly brushed, her small hand clasped in that of her attendant, Princess Charlotte. Only 10 years old, she carried herself with a gravity that seemed to silence those closest to her. There were no shrieks, no pushing forward for photographs, only a curious hush as people realized who they were looking at. For the public, she was a figure of fascination, a child born into centuries of tradition. For the guards, she was more than that. She was a charge to be protected at any cost. From beneath his bare skin, Edward's eyes never moved directly toward her, but his awareness shifted all the same. He had been briefed on days like this. Royals sometimes appeared at the edge of ceremonial duty, sometimes even unannounced, their presence requiring heightened alertness without breaking outward protocol. Charlotte did not act like the other children in the crowd. She didn't fidget, didn't chatter, didn't tug at her attendant's arm for attention. Instead, she stood near the rope line, eyes scanning the people around her with a calm, intent focus, unusual for her age. Edward's gaze remained locked forward, but a soldier's instinct doesn't need sight to know when it is being observed. He could feel her eyes pause on him just for a moment. The rest of the crowd was too busy with photos and chatter to notice the difference, but Edward noticed. And later, he would remember that look because it was the first sign that something about this day would be different. The minutes stretched with ceremonial patience, the guards holding their places as the murmur of the crowd ebbed and swelled. It was the same rhythm Edward Lyle had lived through hundreds of times before. But every performance of tradition is fragile. One loud voice, one careless act, and centuries of dignity can teeter on the edge. The disturbance began with laughter, not the warm kind, but the sharp, mocking kind that cuts through the sound of tourists and instantly draws attention. A group of young men, half a dozen at least, had pressed close to the railings near the centre of the forecourt. Football jerseys clung to their shoulders, the colours bright and brash against the old stone of the palace. Their voices carried, their accents thick with drink and bravado. "Oi, look at him!" one shouted, cupping his hands like a megaphone. "Bet he's not even real, just a mannequin in a hat." The others roared with laughter, slapping each other on the back. A few tourists nearby exchanged uneasy glances, but some couldn't help smiling nervously. That was always the trouble with this kind of disrespect. It invited an audience, daring them to laugh along or to look away. Another voice joined in, louder this time. "How long you reckon he's stood there without blinking? Go on, mate, smile for us." Phones immediately turned toward Edward, hoping to capture a reaction. The red uniform, the bearskin hat, the rifle. These men weren't mocking a soldier, they were mocking the symbol itself, the living tradition of the Guards. Edward didn't move. Not a flicker of muscle betrayed him. His breathing was slow, steady, trained. His eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to acknowledge the taunts. But tradition alone couldn't stop the crowd from reacting. A father with 2 young children tugged them gently back, murmuring, "Come on, let's step away." A few older tourists shook their heads in disapproval, whispering about respect. And then a clear, firm voice cut through the din. "That's quite enough." It belonged to a palace tour guide, a woman in her 50s wearing a neat navy blazer with a badge clipped to the lapel. Her tone carried the kind of authority honed by years of shepherding groups through historic spaces. She stepped toward the football fans, her expression stern. "You're on palace grounds," she said. "These men are not here for your entertainment. Show some respect." The nearest of the young men grinned at her insolently. "Relax, love. We're just having a laugh." Her eyes narrowed. "Some things are not for laughing." For a moment, the tension hung in the air. Then the men shrugged it off, turning back toward the guards with renewed smirks. The guide lingered, but there was only so much she could do. She had no authority to remove them. What most of the crowd didn't notice was the small figure watching from near the rope line, Princess Charlotte. Her attendant kept a steady, polite posture, but Charlotte herself was staring directly at the group of men, her lips pressed in a thin, disapproving line far older than her years. The laughter resumed. Phones recorded. The crowd's focus had shifted from ceremony to spectacle, and though Edward Lyle hadn't moved a single muscle, the balance of the day had already begun to tip. The taunts didn't fade. If anything, the young men grew bolder, buoyed by the uneasy laughter that rippled around them. In crowds, disrespect has a way of feeding itself, gathering confidence from silence. One of them, a tall figure with a shaved head and a St. George's flag draped like a cape, stepped closer to the rope line. His trainers scraped against the cobblestones as he leaned forward, pretending to stumble. His friends whooped and clapped at the performance. "Careful, soldier," he jeered, balancing theatrically just shy of the barrier. "Wouldn't want me to fall on your boots, eh?" The crowd gasped. A few people raised their phones higher, eager to capture what they thought might turn into a viral clip. A child asked his mother if the guard would push the man back. She hushed him quickly, her eyes flicking nervously to the rifle resting at Edward's shoulder. Edward didn't move. His training screamed discipline. Hold the line, absorb the insult, let the ceremony stand taller than the mockery. But behind his stillness, every nerve sharpened. The distance between order and chaos was the length of a single step. The men fed on that stillness, mistaking it for helplessness. "See? Told you," one of them crowed to the others. "They're not allowed to touch you back. He's like a statue, all for show." The onlookers murmured uneasily. Some shook their heads. A tourist couple from abroad whispered in French about shameful behaviour, but no one intervened. Then came the shift, subtle but unmistakable. The tall man adjusted his jacket, and, in the movement, something glinted briefly beneath the fabric. It was quick, no larger than a flash of glass. but enough to draw the eye of someone watching closely. Most of the crowd missed it. Edward saw the shift in posture, but his rigid duty prevented him from moving on instinct. And yet, near the rope line, Princess Charlotte's eyes had locked onto that glint, her small brows knitted together. For a girl of 10, she showed no panic, no shrill alarm. Instead, she pressed closer to her attendant, her gaze unblinking on the group of men. Edward held his stillness, but every detail burned into his awareness. The man's sleeve bulging slightly, the too careful hand placement near his jacket pocket, the cocky grin that didn't reach his eyes. Around them, the atmosphere was shifting. What began as mockery was turning into unease. Families edged back, unsure. Tourists lowered their phones, sensing something more serious than a joke unfolding. And there among them, Princess Charlotte stood straighter, her expression no longer that of a child watching a spectacle, but of someone who understood a signal needed to be given. The moment hovered, fragile as glass. And in the next heartbeat, everything would change. The crowd noise thinned into an uneasy murmur, 100 private conversations blurring into a nervous hum. The men near the barrier still laughed, but their energy had changed. Sharper now, less like play acting and more like testing the edges of what they could get away with. Princess Charlotte hadn't taken her eyes off them. She stood very still for a child, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her chin slightly lifted the way she'd been taught for public appearances, but her eyes, sharp, watchful, and far too old for her age, followed every twitch of the tall man's hand as it hovered by his jacket. Edward Lyle felt the weight of it too. Beneath the bearskin shadowing his face, his jaw tightened. His orders were clear: no reactions, no movement, no acknowledgement unless directly threatened. Protocol was the spine of the guards. Without it, centuries of discipline unravelled. But beneath his rigid posture, his soldier's instinct thrummed like a taut wire. And then Charlotte moved. It was small, so small that most of the crowd mistook it for a child's fidget. She raised her hand, palm open, and crossed her thumb tightly over her palm, while curling her fingers down. The motion was deliberate, not playful. A gesture her father, Prince William, had once taught her. The silent distress signal, recognised across services. A code to mean, I'm not safe. Pay attention. Edward saw it instantly. His pulse jolted. During his security briefings, the officers had drilled certain gestures into memory. Rarely used, but never to be ignored. And this one wasn't just training. This was coming from a royal child standing 20 feet away. Her eyes locked directly onto his. He heard her without words. Do something. Now, for a moment, the world narrowed to just that signal. The crowd thought she was waving. The attendants nearby hadn't even noticed. The men in football jerseys certainly hadn't. They were too busy jeering, oblivious that a little girl had just upended the weight of tradition. Edward's discipline warred with his duty. Guards don't move. Guards don't break formation. But some orders live higher than protocol, and some signals outrank silence. In that heartbeat, he made his choice. Edward shifted. A single deliberate step forward. The sound of his boot striking stone cracked across the courtyard like a rifle shot. The crowd gasped in unison, a wave of shock breaking through their murmurs. Dozens of phones jerked upward at once, filming. The jeering men froze, their laughter dying mid-breath. Even the band, rehearsing faintly inside the palace gates, seemed to falter. Edward's gloved hand slid the rifle across his chest, the gleam of polished steel catching the sunlight. His eyes, hidden behind the shadow of the bearskin, were locked not on the horizon, but on the men at the rope. And for the first time all afternoon his voice cut the air. "Step back! Now!" The words carried like a thunderclap, controlled, sharp, absolute. The crowd went dead silent. The two words, "step back," hung in the air like a commandment. For a moment, nobody moved. The tourists were frozen, caught between awe and disbelief. The young men at the barrier blinked at Edward Lyle as though unsure they'd actually heard him speak. For centuries, guards had stood silent and still, the embodiment of immovable tradition. And now, one of them had broken that silence, not for ceremony, but for a child. The tall man recovered first, a smirk tugging back onto his face. "Easy, mate. Just having a laugh." His voice wavered, thinner than before. Edward took another step forward, his presence swallowing the space between them. His rifle angled across his chest, every line of his body declaring authority. "Away from the barrier, now!" The men faltered. One shuffled back half a step, but the tall one held his ground too long, testing, trying to save face. Then, as he adjusted his jacket again, the shard slipped loose. It clattered against the stone at his feet. A jagged piece of glass bottle, broken sharp at the neck, glittering in the afternoon sun. The gasp that swept through the forecourt was collective, instinctive. Parents pulled children close. Phones, once raised for comedy, now recorded in wide-eyed silence. Edward's voice dropped lower, the kind of calm that makes blood run cold. "Hands where I can see them." The man's bravado drained. His mates backed off quickly, palms up, muttering excuses. "Didn't mean nothing. Just had it in me pocket." But the crowd wasn't buying it anymore, nor was Edward. Within seconds, palace security burst forward from their posts along the edge of the gates, moving fast and precise. Two officers seized the tall man by the arms, forcing him back from the rope line. Another collected the shard with gloved hands. The rest surrounded the group, marching them away with clipped efficiency. All the while, Edward stood between Princess Charlotte and the commotion, unblinking, immovable. He hadn't raised his rifle. He hadn't taken more than 2 steps, but the message was clear. Nothing would pass while he held the line. For the crowd, the transformation was complete. Where a moment earlier they'd seen a silent ornament of tradition, now they saw a soldier, living, alert, decisive. Not a performer, but a protector. The silence was broken only by a child's small voice, carrying just enough to be heard. He moved because she told him to. Dozens of eyes turned toward Princess Charlotte. She stood calm, her hands clasped again, expression composed beyond her years. She had given the signal, and he had answered it. No one who had witnessed it would ever forget. The detained men were dragged back across the courtyard, their protests drowned beneath the stunned hush of hundreds of onlookers. The tourists didn't cheer, didn't clap. They simply watched, as though aware that something older and heavier than entertainment had just taken place. Edward Lyle remained fixed near the rope line, rifle across his chest, posture taut but controlled. He did not glance at the crowd. His duty was clear: stand, shield, protect. And yet, everyone there knew he had already crossed an invisible boundary. The sharp clip of boots against stone broke the silence. From the palace archway, Captain Hughes strode out, tunic pressed, medals glinting, his expression cut from stone. He was a man who embodied discipline, and the sight of one of his guards stepping from formation was not something he tolerated lightly. "Guardsman Lyle!" Hughes barked as he approached, voice carrying across the courtyard. "Explain yourself." Edward did not flinch. His words were steady, pitched just loud enough for those closest to hear. "Her Royal Highness gave the signal, sir. I observed a threat." Murmurs rolled through the crowd like a tide. Heads turned toward the young princess. At 10 years old, she seemed impossibly small, standing just behind the rope, but her chin was lifted, her gaze unwavering. She stepped forward, slipping free of her attendant's guiding hand. "I did," she said clearly. Her voice was high but firm, carrying farther than one might expect from a child. "I saw what he was hiding." The crowd stirred again, gasps, whispers, even a few audible intakes of breath. The royal child herself had spoken, confirming the guard's defiance of centuries of silence. Captain Hughes hesitated, his face caught between protocol and the weight of undeniable truth. His eyes shifted from the broken glass now held in a security officer's evidence bag, back to the princess, then finally to Edward. "Protocol was broken," Hughes said, softer now. Then, after a long pause, "for the right reason." He straightened, adjusting the line of his tunic. "Resume your position, Guardsman." "Yes, sir." Edward pivoted sharply, boots striking the cobblestones with precise rhythm, and returned to his post. His rifle slid back to rest against his shoulder, his stance perfect once again. To the untrained eye, it was as though nothing had happened. But for the crowd, nothing looked the same anymore. A ripple of reverence moved through them. Cameras lowered. Parents whispered explanations to children who had just watched a royal guard break centuries of stillness, not for himself, but for a child's silent call. And behind the rope, Princess Charlotte gave the faintest of nods, an unspoken acknowledgement from one guardian of tradition to another. The forecourt seemed changed, though no flags had shifted and no boots had moved. Where moments before the air had been noisy with chatter and careless jokes, it was now weighted with reverence. Even the children, usually restless and fidgeting at the railings, stood hushed, their wide eyes fixed on the scarlet figure who had dared to move. Edward Lyle was motionless again, rifle balanced, eyes forward beneath the shadow of his bearskin. But his stillness no longer felt like performance. It felt earned. The tourists had seen the difference, how discipline wasn't weakness, how silence wasn't emptiness. The men who had mocked were gone, escorted behind palace gates. The glass shard, once a hidden threat, was sealed in an evidence bag. In its place lingered the memory of a soldier who had stepped forward when it mattered. And at the edge of the rope line, Princess Charlotte was being quietly led back by her attendant. She didn't look frightened. If anything, she looked thoughtful, like someone who understood that what had just happened would never be written on a plaque, never appear in a school book, but would matter all the same. Before she disappeared from view, she glanced once more toward Edward. It was no smile, no wave, just the smallest incline of her head, subtle enough that many might have missed it. But Edward saw it. For a guardsman, whose life was measured in details, it was unmistakable. The band struck up again as though nothing had happened. Brass notes echoed off the stone, filling the courtyard with the practiced rhythm of tradition. The ceremony resumed, precise as clockwork, each movement choreographed by centuries. Yet the crowd didn't return to its old restlessness. Phones remained lowered. Conversations stayed muted. People didn't see a tourist attraction anymore. They saw the living spine of duty standing in red and black before them. And Edward, still silent, his posture unbroken, was exactly where he had been an hour earlier. But to those watching, he was no longer just a figure in uniform. He was the line between chaos and order. He was the man who had broken tradition for the smallest of royals because duty demanded it. The forecourt held that atmosphere, fragile and profound, until the gates finally swung shut behind the next ceremonial march. Would you have noticed Princess Charlotte's secret signal if you were in that crowd? And do you think a royal guard should ever break centuries of tradition? Or only when a royal child gives the order? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. If you were moved by this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss a Royal Guard story like this. And don't forget to share this video with someone who still thinks these guards are just for show. Your next story is already waiting on the screen right now. Click it, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with another Royal Guard moment you won't forget.